It just gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the first of this season's Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences Grand Challenge lecture series. This is a really special event because we are here, at least in part, in person, which I know we're all really pleased to be engaged with. It's also our hybrid event. We've got over 100 people registered for this event, not all in the hall here today, but also our audience online. So a great welcome to our audience online. We're going to have an opportunity to involve you as much as those here in the audience. So as usual, at the end of the lecture, we will have a series of questions that our speaker happy to lead the discussion in those, and there'll be an opportunity for those online to also engage in that way. We're not quite there in terms of normality yet. Ordinarily, we would have been able to offer you drinks and refreshments before the lecture this evening, and also afterwards a chance to sort of mingle with some refreshments as well. I'm afraid we can't do that today, and we're not quite there. I'm very confident during the course of this term, or certainly this year, we will get back to that normality. And certainly it's always a pleasure for me, in a really informal way, to pick up the conversation, often promoted by the lecture or beforehand around the topic, just in an informal way with everybody here. And that's really part of the ethos of these lecture theatres. It's part of the ethos of the institution, that cross dialogue with people bringing different perspectives, different backgrounds, be those academic or from outside our academic community here. So we will return to that, I promise, in the very near future. This evening's lecture is a really fascinating one. It is a cliche to say. I mean, I almost can't bear to say the words that it's a very topical topic. The fact that we're sitting in this rather strange environment, and some of us here and some of us actually online, is a product of the pandemic crisis that we've all been through and experienced in the last 18 months or so. And so I'm going to introduce our lecturer this afternoon or this evening, Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner, and he's going to speak on the topic of COVID-19, the global vaccine access, from equity to nationalism. Now, unlike maybe some of more of our esoteric topics in the future, in the past, I think this is one topic that we're all going to have some levels of opinion on. To some degree, we've all found ourselves as experts in one area of our response to COVID, be that our personal response, be that from our scientific background, be that from our experience of society or policy or any perspective at all. We're all individual experts in that, and we've got our opinions. So I'm really looking forward to the talk this evening. Just as a brief introduction to Mark, Mark is not a stranger to Keele. In fact, he's a recent departure from Keele. He's now at King's College, London, but he was previously a lecturer in law at Keele University before he was there. Mark's now moved to King's, and he's a senior lecturer in global health at the moment. His research specialism is in the field of international law and infectious diseases. And I was just talking to before we started this evening. I'm a professor of infectious diseases, and I've never had a chat with you. So today is the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say and having some of those interdisciplinary conversations. He's recently, most recently, co-authored a monograph on the declaration of a public health emergency of international concern. Obviously, that is COVID. He's held appointments previously as a visiting fellow at the Brochure Foundation in Geneva, and as an emerging leader in biosecurity fellow at the Johns Hopkins Centre for Health Security. And Dr. Eccleston-Turner has also worked as a consultant to the World Health Organization on the procurement of pandemic vaccines. Now, at the end of the lecture, Mark will be very happy to answer questions and engage in some discussion. So we're looking forward to that as part of this evening's proceedings. So without any further ado, just to welcome Mark again. Thank you very much for coming and travelling up to see us in person. It's particularly appreciated as we mark the first of our our hybrid or in-person events of this series of lectures for this academic year. So welcome, Mark, and look forward to hear what you've got to say.
So thank you all so much for being here, whether you're joining us online or whether you're in the room. It's a great honour to come back to Kiel and deliver this this lecture. And today I'm going to be talking about COVID-19 vaccines and access. I think the fact that we're all present here in this room together is as a result of those vaccines. It is only through the deployment of vaccines has life returned to somewhat normality within the UK and as well as in numerous other high-income countries around the world. But what I'm going to be talking about tonight is the fact that that situation is not the same everywhere, that actually billions of people who live in low and middle income countries currently find themselves without access to vaccines. And have not benefited from them as a result. And at the 2020 Executive Health Board of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, described the hoarding of vaccines by high-income countries as a catastrophic moral failure. And with this, I agree. Dr. Tedros is referring to the fact that the world's wealthiest countries have dominated the very limited, finite supply of vaccines which there are around the world. So as of today, 47.5% of all of the world's population has received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. However, that picture is very, very different depending on which country you look at. When you look at the picture in low and middle income countries, and it's important to remember that most people in the world live in a low and middle income country. The majority of the world's population is in these countries. In those countries, only 2.5% of the population has received at least one dose of their COVID-19 vaccine. The reason this has come about is that wealthy countries have aggressively pursued agreements, which I will talk about in my vaccine, to ensure supply for their own populations. And as a result, that the very small number of doses which are available have been procured and distributed in high-income countries. To give you an example, more vaccines have been distributed in the UK than in all low and middle income countries combined. Population of low and middle income countries is over 3 billion. So the same number of doses that we've distributed just here in the UK have been shared amongst 3 billion of the world's poorest people. And what that means is that there are people who are vulnerable to COVID-19 living in low and middle income countries, elderly people, people with chronic health conditions, frontline healthcare workers who currently have to go about their lives without any form of vaccine themselves. Modelling suggests that this trend of wealthy countries stockpiling vaccines will result in nearly twice as many deaths as would occur worldwide had vaccines been equitably shared around the world, with the economic cost running into that of trillions of dollars, and a cost that's actually going to be borne largely by high-income countries. This could also, as I will go on to discuss, generate future variants of concern. And failure to vaccinate the world may actually draw out the pandemic and make the situation last longer. However, the rise in vaccine nationalism for COVID-19 vaccines was entirely predictable. During the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, we saw it then. The first vaccines during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic were administered about 6 months after the pandemic officially began. It took a further 4 months for any vaccine to make it to low and middle income countries, during which time at least 7,000 deaths were recorded, predominantly in low and middle income countries. Now that's a very small number, 7,000 deaths in low and middle income countries. Each one of those deaths was possibly avoidable had vaccines been shared appropriately. However, for those of you who do not remember the 2009 H1N1 outbreak, it was quite a mild outbreak. when you look at its infection to mortality rate, that is the number of people who get infected with 2009 and end up actually dying from it, had a mortality rate of 0.03%. Compare that to typical influenza pandemic strains like Hong Kong flu, which had a 0.1% mortality rate, and the 1918 influenza outbreak had an infection rate of over 2.5%. So the warning signs were there during 2009. It was very clear that high-income countries would hoard vaccines during a pandemic. They'd purchase as many of the doses as they could, and they would hoard them. But we got lucky during 2009. The outbreak wasn't anywhere near as bad as we expected. But this should have been a warning sign to us in the international community that in a future pandemic, hoarding would happen, and we needed to take steps to mitigate against it. So you're probably wondering how this could possibly happen. How can high-income countries, how can the world's wealthiest countries actually take up all of the global supply? Well, it's through agreements which are called advanced purchase agreements. These are a type of contract, a type of agreement between a government and a vaccine manufacturer that prioritizes doses to that country and reserve doses in advance of them actually being manufactured. So we have had a rolling advanced purchase agreement for influenza vaccines for over a decade. And when the next influenza pandemic occurs, we will be at the front of the queue as a result of these agreements. These agreements were widespread during 2009 H1N1 by high-income countries. Most high-income countries had some form of agreement in place to give it priority. And the UK's agreements, which we do have access to, allowed the UK to reserve between the first 30 and the first 130 million doses that vaccine manufacturers based in the UK actually manufactured. The problem with these agreements is that they're wholly unaffordable to low and middle income countries. They're essentially an insurance scheme. They're an insurance scheme for a future event that may not happen for the next 5, 10, 50 years. But every year you have to pay to supplement this agreement. If you have a limited healthcare budget, which most low and middle income countries do, and you also have other healthcare priorities within your country, other healthcare needs, spending a large part of your healthcare budget to reserve doses for a future event that may not happen for another 20 years is not a very effective use of your healthcare budget when you have issues with under 5 mortality or access to bed nets for malaria. So it's not the case of low and middle income countries simply signing these agreements for themselves. There are major financial barriers in place preventing them from doing so. So we saw this during 2009. But let's fast forward to the current outbreak. Let's fast forward to COVID-19. It was very clear right from the start of this pandemic that vaccines were seen as the route out of this pandemic. So at the 73rd meeting of the World Health Assembly, the World Health Assembly is the meeting of all of the members of the World Health Organization. The Assembly passed a resolution which recognized the role of extensive immunization against COVID-19 as a global public good for health in preventing the containment and stopping transmission, and called upon for there to be quality, efficacious, effective, accessible and affordable vaccines. This was a commitment by the international community, by the world, that that vaccines were required, first of all, to be developed, because at that time we had no vaccines, and crucially that those vaccines should be accessible and available in low and middle income countries. Now, the vaccines which we have for COVID-19 are quite extraordinary. As pieces of technology, they are quite extraordinary. They have been developed faster than any other vaccine has been developed in human history. The typical lag time to develop a new vaccine is nearly 20 years. The fastest a vaccine has ever been developed was 4 years, which was for the HPV vaccine. And yet, in 12 months of us identifying the SARS-CoV-2 pathogen, which is the pathogen which causes COVID-19 infection, we had safe and effective vaccines available. That is an extraordinary feat of science. However, it's worth reflecting on why this could even be possible. So there were a couple of things that really accelerated the research and development into COVID-19 vaccines. The first is the fact that the global scale of the pandemic. Most vaccines which are developed for very limited communities, very small groups of people who may have a condition, or where a condition is prevalent just within a small community, at a country or regional level. The other major impetus for research and development into COVID-19 vaccines was the fact that there was this extraordinary impact on high-income countries, which created a demand and created a very, very strong and viable market. One of the most recent vaccines which came to market before COVID-19 was a vaccine called RSV-BOV, which is the vaccine to protect against infection from Ebola. The need for a vaccine against Ebola is extraordinary. It's a very huge problem, particularly in West Africa and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Just yesterday, a new cluster of cases was reported in Kivu, the capital of the DRC. The problem we have with developing vaccines for these sorts of markets is that there is not a strong economic incentive to engage in research and development into a vaccine for Ebola. There's a demand there, there's a need there from the population, but that population happens to exist in some of the poorest regions of the world and therefore does not have the ability to pay. Therefore, there's a lack of economic incentive to engage in research and development. That wasn't the case with vaccines for COVID-19. The market demand, and I use market in a pure economic sense, was huge. These vaccines would be required and purchased by every high-income country in the world. And they'd want them quickly, and they'd want them in very, very large numbers. A couple of other things helped us get vaccines for COVID-19 so quickly. First of all, use of new technology platforms, particularly leveraging mRNA technology to manufacture the vaccines that are being used by Pfizer and Moderna, for example, as well as an expedited regulatory process. And funding was made available at a level which it had never been seen before. All of these things coalesced to mean that we were able to develop not just one, but several vaccines that provided protection for COVID-19 in quite incredible numbers. Quite a lot of the research and development into COVID-19 vaccines was actually provided not by the market, but by governments. One such institution was the ACT Accelerator, which was created by WHO, Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness. Through these institutions, they provided research and development funding to a broad portfolio of potential vaccine candidates to try and accelerate research and development. So they provided research and development funding upfront to vaccine manufacturers as an incentive to get them to research into COVID-19 vaccines. These organizations also provided research and development funding into manufacturing at-risk production. So typically, when you bring a new product to market, a pharmaceutical, a vaccine, or a new drug, you don't start manufacturing it until you've got regulatory approval. Because if you start manufacturing and you don't get regulatory approval, you've now wasted time and money making a product which has to be thrown in the bin. So there was no economic incentive there for manufacturers to start manufacturing vaccines quicker. Problem with that is if we waited until regulatory approval was provided in order to start making vaccines for COVID, that means there's a further delay in getting those vaccines out to the population. So what organizations like Gavi and CEPI and the ACT Accelerator ended up doing was saying, we'll pay for you to start manufacturing these vaccines, and even if it doesn't get regulatory approval and you have to throw them in the bin, you get to keep the money. Okay, so it was an incentive to start that manufacturing quicker. And this funding was not just provided by WHO and CEPI and Gavi, but also provided by governments around the world. So the UK government provided research and development funding for a number of candidates, and also provided funding for at-risk manufacturing and production, and we saw similar things in a number of high-income countries, as well as things like Operation Moonshot in the United States. The ACT Accelerator, or WHO, also had a secondary role to play here. So not only was it incentivizing research and development into these vaccines, but it was also, as we will come to see in a moment, going to try and purchase vaccines on behalf of low and middle income countries. Now, the funding which it provided to manufacturers to do research and development and to do at-risk manufacturing wasn't in any way tied to any future purchasing commitment. So the organizations essentially said, we'll provide you with funding, go and do research and development, and then further down the line, we'll try and negotiate an agreement to purchase these vaccines. This, I think, was a misstep, that there was no funding, there was no tie between the funding which was provided and any future benefits for WHO on behalf of low and middle income countries. So we ended up with a situation here where we socialized risk and privatized profit. We provided significant funding, we as global institutions and governments around the world provided significant research and development funding to incentivize research and development into these products, but didn't get any real benefit at the other end. We didn't get any price commitments or any quality or any quantity commitments provided for low and middle income countries. This, I think, was a mistake. And some of you might now be thinking that I've been talking quite a lot about the need to vaccinate low and middle income countries, and that's great, but our needs are equally as important too in high income countries, that we're all in this together. I think I'd just like to take a moment to dispel that myth, or dispel that. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples just from one low and middle income country, which is Zimbabwe. The lockdown, while we waited for vaccines to be developed in Zimbabwe, was associated with increased food prices, decrease in dietary diversification, disrupted diet and consumption patterns. Half of all Zimbabweans fell into what is classed as extreme poverty. And that is defined as people who are living on less than £21 per month. So half of all of Zimbabweans fell into that category. 500,000 households had at least one person who was rendered unemployed because of the pandemic and because of the lockdown in Zimbabwe. Wages dropped, and 23 of the poorest people had lost their jobs. Just under 20% of the population, just under 20% of women of childbearing age in Zimbabwe currently has what is classed as meeting a diet which meets the minimum nutritional requirements for childbearing. That is halved during the pandemic period, down from 43% last year. The number of children receiving the minimum level of nutrition in Zimbabwe has gone from being 6.9% to 2.1%. So the effects of the pandemic are not being felt equally around the world. In settings like low and middle income countries where there is a lack of social net and a lack of social safety net, the effects of the pandemic, and in particular the effect of the response to the pandemic through lockdowns, has been felt more acutely than in high income settings. However, despite the fact that there is this clear need for vaccine equity, as things stand as of today, only 2.5% of people living in a low and middle income country has received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. However, use of advanced purchase agreements by high income countries is skyrocketing. At present, the EU has got formal commitments to advanced purchase agreements to purchase 10 doses per member of the population within the European Union. The UK has reserved at least enough vaccine to immunise the population 6 times over. The worst culprit so far is Canada, which has agreements in place to immunise at least to give every single Canadian 13 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine. And yet COVAX, which is the global initiative to distribute vaccines on behalf of to all low and middle income countries, has donated only 250 million doses as of today. The moral case against this COVID-19 vaccine nationalism, I think, is quite clear. And no matter what ethical framework you use to evaluate vaccine nationalism, I believe it fails at each one of them. Whether we use a utilitarian framework, where we look at maximizing the health and well-being of the population, utilitarians should endorse vaccination strategies that save the most lives, either as a direct result of immunization or through ending the pandemic in its entirety. Given that global cooperation to distribute vaccines is expected to halve the number of deaths from COVID-19, utilitarians should endorse global sharing and endorse strategies where nations are able to access vaccines on the basis of need, not necessarily on the basis of the ability to pay. Egalitarians who believe that equity or equality is the central moral impetus entail anti-nationalist views that given that vulnerability, as I have just demonstrated, is not equally distributed amongst the nations of the world, egalitarians should equally support global vaccination strategies and sharing. The historical basis of the science that led to these vaccines entails a globally held commitment to engage in the fair and global vaccine distribution. These are not British vaccines made by British scientists. These are the result of international cooperation stretching decades into the past. It makes me think of that idea of standing on the shoulders of giants. The work which was done at Oxford to develop the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was an impressive piece of the puzzle, a final piece of the puzzle. But that work, that puzzle, stretched back decades and around many researchers all around the world. Even those people who support a social contract theory that privilege self-interest or duties to our fellow citizens before duties to citizens of other nations should believe in anti-nationalist vaccine distribution. The emergence of COVID-19 vaccine strains such as the Delta variant or B13 in South Africa illustrates that existing vaccines may not protect developed nations if variants can escape vaccines are generated elsewhere in the world. Current variants have not yet challenged existing vaccines, but the vaccination of developed nations to the exclusion of low and middle income countries may eventually be self-defeating. If rich nations hoard vaccines, whilst variants appear in low and middle income countries which end up escaping the vaccines which we've administered in our own countries. Theories that outline a duty to our fellow citizens should also endorse anti-nationalist views for one reason and one reason alone. The best and the best, maybe the only way to protect my fellow citizens is to protect everyone in the world from COVID-19. The moral case against vaccine nationalism is strong, and anti-nationalist strategies that maximize return on a scarce public good are required. And they're better for individuals and they're better for global injustices. So it is my position that there is not a moral case for hoarding vaccines. And yet, this continues to happen, and actually is happening again right now. Despite this very clear moral case, and despite the very clear scientific evidence that immunizing the rest of the world is the best thing to protect our nation, high-income countries are currently engaged in the process of negotiating but further advanced purchase agreements to be able to provide booster shots to their populations or to expand immunization programs to communities who do not have as great a benefit from those vaccines as people living in low and middle income countries. Just to give you an example of the current state of advanced purchase agreements, these are the agreements of which we are aware of the UK government currently having in place. as well as the current situation within the European Union as well. And it's important to recognize that this isn't a matter of charity. This isn't a matter of us merely providing our excess doses to low and middle income countries when we have satisfied our own needs. This is an issue of justice. This is an issue of equity. But most importantly, even if you take a self-interest approach here, it is in our self-interest to immunize the rest of the world and immunize the rest of the world in real time. This is something that we should have been doing for a very, very long time, since the start of the pandemic, since the start of vaccines being available. Access eventually in a low and middle income country is neither equity nor is it justice. So the approach to procuring vaccines on behalf of low and middle income countries has largely been left to the COVAX facility. This is a facility which was created alongside the ACT Accelerator, which I outlined earlier. And it seeks to use pooled funding, seeks to try and negotiate advance purchase agreements in a pooled way on behalf of low and middle income countries, using the funding and the facilities set up by WHO, Gavi and CEPI, as I outlined earlier. And COVAX set out to immunize and procure and distribute 2 billion doses by the end of this year. As of today, they're on 250 million doses. That's quite a lot of work to do before the end of the year. It's very clear that COVAX will miss its target and will miss its target by a significant number. What COVAX also did was allow countries, high-income countries such as ours, to also purchase vaccines through the COVAX facility. So this wasn't just something that low and middle-income countries could use, but actually high-income countries as well. So some of those vaccines which have been delivered to Canada, who have 13 doses per head of the population, actually came from COVAX. Vaccines which could have, and arguably should have, been distributed to low and middle-income countries, ended up going to some of the richest nations in the world. These are the current agreements which we know COVAX has in place. And I say we know, one of the problems we have with looking into this area is that all of these agreements are not public documents. So we have to rely on leaked memos and leaked contracts and documents to try and get a sense of what is actually happening in the world. But as you can see, the supply is nowhere near enough to meet demand. And this is an inequality which will perpetuate and will continue until high-income countries recognize the moral obligation which they have, not just to citizens of low and middle-income countries, which I think is there is a moral obligation and a strong moral obligation, but also the obligations which we have to our fellow citizens. Because as I've outlined, the best thing to protect our fellow citizens in this country is to immunize people in low and middle-income countries as soon as possible. So this problem will continue until we get to a situation where high-income countries recognize such a duty. And one of the things that's quite bizarre, as I outlined about the Canadian situation, is that COVAX allowed and even encouraged high-income countries to negotiate advance purchase agreements as well as purchasing through COVAX. So we were in a situation where not only were we, on one hand, negotiating these advance purchase agreements with vaccine manufacturers, but we were also negotiating for purchasing through COVAX. So we ended up in a situation where we were getting direct supply from vaccine manufacturers and also being eligible to take vaccines through the COVAX facility, vaccines, finite doses, which could have been distributed elsewhere to COVAX participating countries, particularly low and middle income countries. This approach ultimately further delays vaccine distribution getting to low and middle income countries while we continue to take doses from COVAX. And given the time, I think I will leave it there and open the, let us have an opportunity to have a discussion, and thank you very much.